At Christmas dinner, my stepdad dug his fingers into my arm so hard he left a purple mark because I refused to buy my brother a $100,000 car. The sound of his nails against my skin cut right through the clatter of forks and the warm hum of holiday chatter that had filled the dining room only seconds earlier. For a moment, the soft glow of the string lights felt harsh and cold against my face, and something in the room shifted the same way a fireplace does when a sudden draft hits it. Every pair of eyes flicked toward me, but no one moved, no one spoke, no one stepped in. Rick tightened his grip once more before letting go like he was dropping a useless object. "You are only useful when you are paying for this family," he said loud enough for every person at the table to hear. Jordan laughed into his napkin, the same smug laugh he had used for years whenever my paycheck saved him from another mess. My mother stared down at her plate, pretending to be absorbed by the mashed potatoes she had stirred so lovingly that morning. I felt the stares waiting to see whether I would explode or crumble, and for a moment I wondered what would disappoint them more. The scent of cinnamon and roasted turkey hung in the air, but all I could smell was the metallic trace of panic rising in my throat. The pain in my arm pulsed in time with my heartbeat, but the humiliation beat faster. Rick leaned back in his chair full of confidence and entitlement and said, "You make more than any of us. What is 100,000 to you?" The words slid across the table, slick and oily, and they landed exactly where he wanted them to. They told everyone I was the one with money, the one with responsibility, the one who could be pressed, squeezed, drained. They also gave just the faintest hint that he knew something about me that the others did not, something about where my money came from, something they were not supposed to have access to. His eyes told me he had already taken more than he should have. I stared at the mark forming on my arm, the dark spots blooming across my skin like a stain that had been waiting years to surface. The pain was sharp, but the realization was sharper. I had not lost control of a single moment in that room. They had. I kept my voice silent even though the words in my head were loud and angry. My family had turned me into a walking wallet, one they could hit, shake steal from, and still expect me to thank them afterward. The bruise forming under my sleeve was not just from the force of Rick's hand. It was the mark of every bill I had paid, every debt I had covered, every sacrifice I had made to keep this family upright while they stood on my shoulders. That night, as I pushed back my chair and stood in a room that no longer pretended to love me, I said nothing. Silence was the only thing I still owned in that house. But in my mind, the words had already formed a sentence that felt like a verdict. If they saw me only as their bank, then this time the receipt would be in my name permanently. I walked out into the cold Oregon air, the lights from inside glowing behind me, like a house welcoming everyone, except the one person who had paid for half of what was in it. Before I stepped off the porch, Rick called after me with one more dig. "You think you are special because some old man left you a little fund." His voice carried the arrogance of someone who believed he had access to things he never should have touched. My chest tightened. Old man, fund. The words echoed with a chill that was not from the December air. He was not supposed to know anything about that fund, and if he did know, then someone had told him, or someone had let him reach into something that belonged entirely to me. I opened my car door, paused, and finally looked at the bruise spreading along my arm. Purple pressing into blue shaped exactly like his fingers. It throbbed like a warning, but also like a promise. They thought I would always pay. They thought the guilt, the pressure, the obligations, the history would keep me trapped in that house forever. They forgot who actually reads the fine print in this family. They forgot who keeps the documents, who signs the checks, who pays attention to every cent that leaves an account. They forgot I was the one person in that room who actually understood how money moves and how justice can follow it. I sat behind the wheel and let the engine hum to life, while my other hand hovered over the bruise. It hurt. It burned. It reminded me what this night truly was. not a family dinner, a final warning, and maybe the first moment of freedom I had allowed myself in years. As I pulled away from the house, I whispered to myself, not out of fear, but conviction. They think they marked me tonight. They have no idea what I'm about to mark down about them. I drove through the cold Oregon night with one hand gripping the steering wheel and the other pressed against the tender bruise on my arm, trying to keep the throbbing pain from climbing into my throat. The lights along the highway stretched into thin white lines, and every time I blinked, I could still see Rick's fingers pressed into my skin as if the imprint had sunk deeper than the surface. My breath fogged the air inside the car, and I forced myself to inhale slowly because the shaking in my hands was getting worse. The road from Beaverton to Portland felt longer than usual, and the silence inside the car gave my thoughts more room than I wanted. I kept replaying the moment at the table the way someone replays an accident in slow motion, and each time the impact felt just as sharp. My voice slipped into the rhythm of my thoughts as if narrating a truth I had ignored for too long. I had paid for Jordan's car repairs 3 times, even though he never thanked me. I had covered the medical bill when my mother sprained her wrist, even though she never asked how much it cost me. I had been the emergency fund for a family that never called it what it was. They called it love. They called it duty. But inside the car tonight, it felt like the word should have been extraction. The bruise under my sleeve pulsed like a message, and I whispered into the darkness as if someone needed to hear it besides me. My name is Kira, 26, a junior project coordinator for a construction firm in Portland, Oregon. I've been the responsible one in my family since I was old enough to sign a check. Saying it out loud made the years of imbalance unfold like a ledger opening to a page I had ignored. A flash of memory came in the rear view like a ghost. Jordan at 15 dropping the family television screen first onto the floor. The crack was loud enough to wake the neighborhood. Before I could even look at him, Rick had turned straight to me with that familiar impatient sigh and said, "You are the only one with a steady job. Just replace it." I remember standing there thinking I was barely making above minimum wage, and yet I still nodded because it seemed easier than arguing. I remember Jordan smirking like my wallet was his backup generator. It was not a dramatic fight or a life-changing moment. It was an ordinary American household scene, the kind that shaped me more than I realized until I was old enough to buy my own groceries and still somehow buying everyone else's too. The highway curved toward the city, and the skyline flickered faintly behind the clouds. That was when another old memory drifted forward, one I had not revisited in years. My grandfather, sitting with me at his kitchen table when I was 8, folding his reading glasses and telling me he had set aside a college fund for me. Nothing fancy he had said, but enough to give you a start. Back then, it felt like a secret piece of hope, something that meant I was seen. My mother had told me later, we had to borrow from it for the family. You understand, right? And because I loved her and trusted her, I said of course, without ever asking what borrow meant or whether borrow ever turned into return. The bruise burned again just thinking of it. When I reached my small Portland apartment, I sat for a moment in the quiet, letting the engine tick itself cool. Then I climbed out, walked upstairs, and locked the door behind me like the sound could keep the world outside from pressing in. I did not turn on the lights. The glow from my laptop screen was enough. I opened it, signed in, waited for the familiar 2-factor prompt, and then clicked into my online banking and the investment account labeled Harbor Fund. My grandfather had named it after the place he loved most on the Oregon coast. It felt wrong that tonight it carried a feeling closer to dread. The number on the screen was not what I remembered. It was lower, far lower than the last time I checked, and the drop was not small enough to blame on market fluctuations. Something had been taken. My pulse jumped. I clicked into transaction history, scrolling, slowly searching for anything that felt out of place until one entry stopped me cold. A withdrawal from a few months earlier labeled family expenses. The words themselves annoyed me, but the attached digital signature made my stomach tighten. It was supposed to be mine, but the shape, the slant, the pressure of the strokes did not look like anything I had ever written. It looked like someone trying to be me and failing. The room seemed quieter after that discovery, as if even the walls were listening. I leaned closer to the screen, studying the signature again and again, waiting for it to morph into something familiar. It never did. Instead, a chilling thought formed with perfect clarity. If someone had forged my name on something tied to the Harbor Fund, then someone had crossed a line more severe than a bruise or an insult at a dinner table. Someone had moved into territory where money and legality met, and where the truth always finds a way to surface. I zoomed in on the scan until the pixels blurred into soft squares and stared at the fake version of my own handwriting. For a moment, it felt like I was looking not at a forged document, but at a second wound, one that had been there long before tonight's bruise began to darken. The first mark he left was not on my arm. It was under my name. I stayed frozen in my chair for a long moment after staring at the forged signature, feeling the cold from my apartment floor move up through my legs until it settled in my chest. Then I clicked away from the transaction view and opened a broader history, because something inside me whispered that this was not the first irregularity. It was simply the first one I had bothered to look at closely. My fingers hovered over the trackpad before I finally pulled up 2 years of banking activity, then 3 because the bruises on my arm and in my memory made me brave enough to see what was really there. The first entries that caught my eye were familiar ones, rent payments for my mother, that showed up every time she said the landlord was being unreasonable. I remembered writing checks on her behalf, promising myself I would not make it a habit, but the habit had formed around me long before I realized it. I scrolled further and saw payments tagged to her credit card bills that she swore she would pay me back for once she got her tax return. She never did. Then came the charges for Jordan's trade school costs that were supposed to be covered by a program he qualified for, but he had missed a deadline, and by the time I found out the fees were already due. No one asked if I could afford it. They simply asked how fast I could send it. The more I scrolled, the more ordinary and familiar the pattern became. Small charges took up as much space as the big ones. Cups of coffee for my mother when she forgot her wallet, online subscriptions for the household that somehow ended up billed only to me, internet payments that Rick insisted he handled, yet the withdrawals came from my debit card every month. Even the ridiculous microtransactions for quick fix tools that Jordan bought and never used had come directly from my account. Each line felt like a piece of a story I had been living in without reading it. I opened a blank spreadsheet and started entering the numbers, because numbers had always been the one thing that stayed honest in my life. I listed every transfer, every bill, every emergency loan, every so-called temporary cover that never found its way back to me. The columns filled with dates and amounts until the screen looked like a financial autopsy table, and I was the only witness to the cause of death. As I typed, I remembered a moment from a year earlier when Rick had walked past me while I was balancing receipts for work. He had given this laugh the kind that layered mockery with pretense and said, "You are good with numbers, you can handle it." At the time, I thought he was giving me credit. Tonight I understood he had been giving me a job, one that came with no compensation and no appreciation and no end date until now. When the spreadsheet finally reflected the total, I leaned back slowly, letting the number settle into the center of my vision. Over the last 3 to 4 years, I had funneled an amount into my family that was hovering just under the price of the car Rick demanded tonight. It was as if the bruise on my arm, the forged signature, and this staggering total had joined hands and pointed directly at the truth. They did not want help. They wanted access, unrestricted, constant, expected access. And I had allowed it because I thought helping them made me a good daughter and a good sister. The refrigerator hummed in the background as I stared at the screen. It was a low, rhythmic sound, steady but distant, and for some reason it made the realization heavier. I was looking not at a spreadsheet, but at a report of every time I had chosen them over myself. Every unpaid loan, every unquestioned request, every moment when I had said yes, because saying no felt like too much trouble. I did not slam my hand on the table or curse or cry. I just breathed slowly, feeling the invisible weight of all those years shifting inside me. The bruise on my arm pulsed again, as if agreeing that this history mattered more than the pain. I noticed how naturally I navigated each sheet, each formula, how quickly I understood the meaning of terms like beneficiary, cosigner, disbursement schedule, without needing to Google them. These were not the skills of someone naive with money, no matter how they treated me at that dinner table. Maybe they had forgotten that I had been reading fine print since I was a child sitting beside my grandfather. It was a small reminder that I was not as powerless as they wanted me to feel. When I closed the spreadsheet, I reopened the documents folder where I kept old personal files. Something nudged my memory, a faint echo of my grandfather saying, "Always keep a copy." So I searched for it, and there it was, a faintly labeled PDF that I had not opened in years, scanned and emailed to me by my grandfather shortly before he passed. Harbor Fund Trust. My pulse quickened. I clicked it open and watched as the carefully typed lines filled the screen. I skimmed the first page and paused when my eyes landed on a clause I had completely forgotten about. It was small, neatly tucked under a paragraph about distribution, but its meaning was sharp and unmistakable. It was a detail I had not yet explored, and suddenly everything in my chest settled into a new shape. The exploitation did not start tonight, but tonight might be the first time I finally saw it clearly. The PDF opened slowly, as if the file itself understood the weight of what I was about to read, and the title Harbor Fund Trust appeared at the top of the screen, just as I remembered it from years ago. My grandfather had created the fund when I was still in middle school, and he had told me then, in a quiet voice, that it was not much, but it was sturdy enough to give me a foundation. As the document loaded fully, I felt my pulse steady into a slow, deliberate rhythm the way it always did when I was reading something that mattered. The trust stated clearly on the first page that it held approximately $80,000 set aside exclusively for me, and specified in plain, simple language that the money was intended for education housing or a business startup. I mouthed the words as I read them because they felt both familiar and foreign, like a language I had known but never used. That money had always been a symbol of his belief in me, a gentle, quiet reminder that someone in my family saw a future for me beyond paying everyone else's bills. Then the memory of my mother's voice slid into my mind uninvited. We had to use some of it for Jordan's trade school. It is all family, right? When she had said that years ago, I had not questioned it. I had nodded, trusting that if she said borrow, she meant it. I had not thought to open the trust document and read the terms myself because I believed her word was enough. Now that sentence sharpened like a blade pressed gently, but unmistakably against the truth. I scrolled downward, and that was when I saw it. A clause so clear, it felt like a spotlight turning on inside my apartment. No distributions to any other beneficiary without Kira's written consent. I read it twice, then again, because the meaning was so straightforward, it almost felt cruel. If Jordan had used money from the trust, if anyone had pulled funds for him, or for family expenses, or for anything outside of my own needs, it required my signed permission. And I had never signed anything of the sort. My breath tightened, and for a moment, I felt the same sting along my arm where Rick had grabbed me at the dinner table. It pulsed in time with the truth slow at first, then louder, then unmistakable. I switched to the second document, the one associated with the request for funds, and located the disbursement form attached to the suspicious transaction I had seen earlier. At first glance, it appeared filled out correctly, but then my eyes found the signature line. There it was. My name written in a slanted, uneven script that looked nothing like my actual handwriting. It was a performance of my signature rather than the real thing, a bad impersonation. I leaned closer until the light from the laptop screen cast a faint glow across my cheek. This was not an oversight. It was not a misunderstanding. Someone had forged my consent on an official trust document. Someone had taken money meant solely for me and done it illegally. Financial fraud in the simplest sense. The bruise on my arm throbbed again, as if reminding me that the assault at the dinner table and this violation on paper were two sides of the same cruelty, the physical mark he left and the financial mark they hid. I lifted my bruised arm and rested my hand lightly against the edge of the laptop screen, letting the pain settle into the moment. I stared at the place where the fake signature sat and then at the purple imprint fading under the light fabric of my sleeve. For the first time, the connection between the two marks felt aligned. One was visible and fresh and cruel. The other had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for me to discover it. Both told the same story. Both proved the same truth. I closed my eyes for a second and another memory surfaced, one from 8 years ago on the morning of my 18th birthday. My grandfather had handed me a manila folder with a soft seriousness in his eyes. "Never sign anything you have not read, Kira, and always keep a copy." His voice came back with such clarity it felt as though he were standing beside me again. In that moment, the significance of what I held in my digital files became sharper. The trust document, the scanned copies, the emails, the forms he had once mailed to me, they were more than paperwork. They were protection. They were proof. They were the first seeds of the power he intended me to have one day, and the family who had pressed their weight onto my shoulders for years had no idea I still had them. I opened my eyes again and stared at the forged signature with a new stillness inside me. There was no anger rising, no shouting building, no chaos in my chest. What filled me instead was clarity. If my name had been forged, then this was not only immoral, it was actionable. It meant someone could be held accountable legally, financially, and publicly. It meant the bruise on my arm was not the only evidence that mattered. It meant the line they crossed could be traced, documented, and proven. A thin, calm breath escaped me as the realization settled fully into its place. For the first time, I was not just the one paying the bills. I was the one holding the receipts. The forged signature stayed burned in my mind long after I closed my laptop and crawled into bed with the kind of exhaustion that does not come from lack of sleep, but from seeing a truth too clearly. By morning, the bruise on my arm had darkened into a deeper shade, reminding me that the night before had been real, no matter how unreal it felt. I pulled on a long-sleeve shirt before leaving the apartment, though the fabric pressed against the tender skin in a way that made me wince. Lena had texted me, asking if I could meet her for coffee before work, and I agreed because something inside me needed a voice that was not mine. The cafe sat on a quiet Portland corner with fog still clinging to the windows. I walked in and saw Lena already seated, stirring her drink, with the absent-minded motion of someone who has lived enough life to be unbothered by small discomforts, but deeply alert to the big ones. She looked up the second I approached, and the smile on her face softened into concern. I had barely sat down when she reached across the table, catching a glimpse of the bruise as my sleeve shifted. She stopped stirring. "Who did that?" she asked. Not gently, not cautiously, but directly in the way older women do when they have no interest in pretending. I felt the instinct to lie rise in my throat like an old reflex, but it dissolved under the weight of everything that had happened. "My stepdad," I said. He grabbed me, because I said no. The words came out steady, but speaking them felt like stepping onto new ground. Lena stared as if trying to make sense of violence happening during what was supposed to be a holiday dinner. "On Christmas," she whispered. "He left a mark on you on Christmas." The disbelief in her voice hit harder than the bruise did. In her reaction, I saw what I had been trained not to see my whole life. This was not normal, and it never should have been treated as anything close to a family argument. She leaned back, shaking her head, her expression shifting into something sharper. "What else happened, Kira? Something tells me that bruise is not the whole story." I hesitated only for a breath before everything began to spill out. The trust my grandfather left, the withdrawals, the forged signature, the demand for the $100,000 car, the years of bills and favors and debts that never found their way back to me. I kept my voice level, but inside I felt the same careful ticking I heard when I reviewed contracts at work. When I finished, Lena exhaled slowly, as if processing the whole picture piece by piece. Her eyes hardened not with judgment toward me, but with anger on my behalf. "This is not family," she said. "This is exploitation." Hearing the words spoken aloud made something settle inside me like a puzzle piece clicking into place. I had lived in the pattern so long that naming it felt strange, almost foreign. Exploitation. A word that described everything I had been avoiding naming. She studied me again, then asked, "Did you ever sign anything for that trust? Any form that let them use it?" I shook my head. Never. I did not even know they were using it. Lena's mouth pulled into a thoughtful frown, the kind that comes right before she says something practical and unflinching. "If that money came from a trust, you need to talk to an attorney. Trusts are paperwork. Paperwork can bite back." Her words landed quietly but firmly, as if they were not advice but direction. I felt my shoulders loosen just slightly with the possibility that someone else could help me untangle the mess. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, tapping quickly before sliding it across the table. A name and number were already on the screen belonging to a financial attorney in downtown Portland. "She is good," Lena said. "She helped me during my divorce. She does not tolerate people being taken advantage of, especially financially." I stared at the contact for a moment, feeling the weight of a shift happening inside me. The bruise on my arm was still there, but it no longer felt like the only mark that mattered. I wrapped my fingers around the phone as Lena added, "If you are done being their wallet, this is where you start." Her voice carried no pressure, no judgment, only certainty, as if she knew I had reached the point where deciding to act was not about anger, but about finally seeing the truth without blinking. The fog outside the window had begun to lift, letting a soft light spill across the table, and for the first time since Christmas dinner, I felt like I was breathing air that belonged to me. I walked into the downtown Portland office with Lena's referral still open on my phone and a stack of printed documents tucked under my arm. The bruise on my skin had shifted into a deeper shade, but by now it felt less like a wound and more like a reminder of the line that had been crossed. The receptionist led me down a quiet hallway into a small conference room where Eleanor Briggs was waiting. She stood as I entered, offering a firm professional handshake that told me she was a woman who dealt in facts, not sympathy. She looked about 58 with calm, steady eyes and the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades untangling financial knots, much worse than mine. Once we sat, she folded her hands and said, "Tell me why you are here, Kira." Her voice carried no rush, no judgment, only expectation. So I opened my folder and began laying everything on the table. The trust document, the suspicious transactions, the disbursement form with the forged signature, and even the notes I had made in my spreadsheet the night before. She listened without interrupting her eyes, narrowing only slightly when I described the dinner, the demand for the $100,000 car, and the years of quietly covering my family's bills. When I placed the disbursement form in front of her, she pulled it toward herself, adjusting her glasses before reading each line with precise attention. Then she tapped the signature with the blunt end of her pen and looked straight at me. "If this signature is not yours," she said slowly, "this is not family borrowing. This is fraud." Hearing the word spoken aloud in this room made it feel heavier than when I had said it in my head. Fraud. A word that did not soften under excuses or family sentiment, a word that lived in courts and legal records. She continued, and her tone grew firmer. "If your stepfather forged your signature, that is a criminal act. If he used the trust for anything outside its stated purpose, that is a civil issue, and he can be held financially liable. You could pursue restitution. You could pursue an investigation if needed." Her clarity sliced through the fog I had been living in for years. I nodded, absorbing every word. Then I reached back into my bag and pulled out something I had not shown anyone in years, the original paper copy of the Harbor Fund Trust that my grandfather had placed into my hands when I was 18. I laid it on the table and said, "My family does not know I still have this." Eleanor lifted the document carefully, her expression shifting as she recognized its significance. Paper original signatures, notarized pages, all intact. It was more than a document. It was leverage. It was the piece they never expected me to hold. She read through it slowly, comparing the language to the scanned version on my laptop, and eventually pointed to the clause about no distributions without my written consent. "This is your anchor," she said. "This clause protects you, and it will corner whoever took funds without permission." I felt something almost like relief tug at my chest, but it was quieter than relief, more controlled, more like confirmation that the ground beneath me had been real all along. Eleanor leaned back and began outlining the steps with the same calm tone one might use when explaining a routine process, though nothing about it felt routine to me. "First, gather all documentation of withdrawals," she said. "Every transaction connected to the trust. Second, if your stepfather contacts you and admits to using the money, record the conversation. Oregon allows single-party consent, so your recording would be valid. Third, keep every email, every text message, and any communication related to money. These will support your case." I nodded, taking mental notes, feeling the structure of a plan form around me. She continued, "The goal is not necessarily to sue immediately, although you have grounds. The goal is to present evidence strong enough that he will be forced to sign a restitution agreement. He will return the money. He will acknowledge misuse of the trust, and he will legally agree to stop all financial harassment." A legal agreement felt like something concrete, something powerful enough to shift the balance of my entire relationship with that household. I thought of Rick's confidence at the dinner table, of the way he squeezed my arm as if I were a thing he controlled. And then I thought of the forged signature. I breathed in slowly, letting the reality settle. This was no longer about getting them to respect me. This was about establishing boundaries backed by law, not emotion. Eleanor gathered the documents back into a neat pile and pressed them toward me. "You have more than enough to start," she said. "They cross lines they should not have crossed. Now you get to decide how to respond." As I placed everything back into my folder, she added one final sentence, the one that stayed with me long after I left her office. "You do not have to scream to win Kira. You just have to show up with the right papers." I drove home from Eleanor's office with the folder of documents still warm in my lap, and the taste of certainty settling slowly into my chest. Yet as soon as I stepped inside my apartment and closed the door behind me, the quiet of the room pressed in, and something older, darker, began to rise. It was the familiar feeling of being 17 again, standing in a hallway that smelled of lemon cleaner and cheap aftershave, waiting for Rick's hand to tighten around my wrist, because I had done something as harmless as coming home 10 minutes late. The bruise on my arm from Christmas pulsed softly, reminding me that this was not new. This was only the first time it had been undeniable. I sat on the edge of my couch, letting the memory unspool as clearly as if the past had been waiting for an invitation. I remembered the first time Rick grabbed me hard enough to make me wince. I had been 16, maybe 17, and I had spoken up during an argument about bills, something as simple as saying that I could handle getting a part-time job. He had taken my arm between his fingers and squeezed just enough for me to feel the warning. His voice had been low, not angry, but controlled in the way that told me anger was waiting just beneath the surface. "Do not talk back." That was the rule. And afterward, when the print of his fingers lingered on my skin, my mother had whispered in the kitchen, "He is just stressed. Do not provoke him." She said it so softly and so often that I learned to believe the tension in the house was my responsibility to manage, that if I stayed quiet, things would stay calm, that if I did not push, he would not push back. It took me years to see how that was its own kind of conditioning. At 18, when he shoved me lightly against the wall because I had forgotten to set the table, my mother had given me the same tired reassurance. He does not mean it, Kira. He is under pressure. Let it go. But letting it go only made room for the next time, and the next, and the next, until the line between normal and unacceptable blurred so completely that I could not tell the difference. Sitting there now with my arm still marked from Christmas, I felt the full weight of those moments folding into each other. I had been trained to endure, trained to absorb, trained to make myself small so the household felt bigger. But this time something was different. This time there was visible evidence, a bruise shaped like his fingers blooming purple along the inside of my arm. It was impossible to pretend away, impossible to excuse, impossible to call anything but what it was. A line crossed, a point of no return. I lifted my sleeve and stared at the mark, letting the past and present coexist for a moment that felt strangely grounding. For the first time since that dinner, I let myself say the truth aloud. This is the last time. The last time he puts his hands on me. The last time he calls it discipline or stress or family expectations. The last time I swallow it and move on. Because something else had also resurfaced a memory not of fear, but of clarity. My grandfather sitting with me on the back porch of his house in Newport when I had been 18, holding the trust papers in his weathered hands, telling me with a seriousness I had not understood then. When people show you their hand, do not forget it. One day you might need to call it. At the time I thought he meant life in general. I did not realize he meant moments like this, times when someone believed they had you cornered only because you had not yet played the card they did not know you held. Now with the trust documents sorted on my table and the legal plan forming, I finally felt the meaning land. Rick had shown his hand. Every year he tightened his grip financially, emotionally, physically. He believed I would keep accepting it because I always had. He believed the bruise would fade the way others had. But the trust, the forged signature, the withdrawals, the attorney, none of that had been part of his calculation. And for the first time, I felt the shift inside me, not loud or dramatic, but steady. I picked up my phone and opened the camera. The room was quiet, my breathing even. I positioned my arm so the bruise was visible in the soft evening light and took a photo. The click of the shutter felt like its own kind of declaration, something between a promise and a record. I created a new folder in my cloud storage and labeled it Receipts. Not to savor the hurt, but to document what had been real, what had been ignored, what would no longer be dismissed. As I uploaded the photo, I felt something loosen in my chest. It was not revenge. Not yet. It was recognition. A final acknowledgement of a pattern I had spent too long trying to downplay. For once, I was not just swallowing it. I was documenting it. The morning after, I saved the bruise photo into the folder labeled Receipts. My phone began to vibrate before the sun had even fully risen over Portland. At first I let it ring, assuming it was a wrong number, but then it rang again and again, until the familiar weight settled in my stomach. Only one person called with that kind of persistence. When the fourth call came through, I answered without speaking. There was a beat of silence followed by Rick's voice sharp, irritated already, framing himself as the victim. "You need to come back and fix this family mess," he said, as if I were a runaway employee instead of a daughter who had been bruised at Christmas dinner. "You stormed off and made everything dramatic. Your mother is upset. Jordan is confused. You made a scene that did not need to be made." The word dramatic rolled off his tongue with the same dismissiveness he had used my entire life, reducing my pain into performance, reducing his actions into harmless misunderstandings. I did not reply. His impatience flared immediately. "Are you listening or are you pouting? This is exactly what I mean. You are ungrateful, Kira. We have done everything to help you, and this is how you repay us." I stared at the wall, noticing how the early light cast long stripes across the paint. I kept my breathing steady, remembering Eleanor's instruction from the day before. If he calls, record it. His own words will matter more than anything you explain. Slowly, quietly, I slid my thumb across the screen and activated the recorder. Rick kept talking completely unaware. "You think you can just walk out," he snapped. "Families handle things together. If you had stayed long enough to hear me out, you would have realized we were trying to solve problems, not create them." I wanted to laugh at the irony, but I kept still letting him fill the silence with his version of reality. He took the absence of my rebuttal as an invitation to escalate. "Do you know how ungrateful you sound leaving us like that? Without us, you are just some girl with a clipboard at a construction site." That line hit, not because it was true, but because it was meant to shrink me, flatten me into something insignificant. He had always believed that what I did, what I achieved, only mattered when he approved of it. And now that I had stepped away, it no longer served him to pretend pride. I felt the cold clarity settle again. I still did not answer. He huffed, irritated by my refusal to feed the argument. Then his tone shifted, becoming more urgent, but also more careless, the way people speak when they forget to guard their intentions. "And you know what?" he said, lowering his voice as if he were disclosing something noble. "We used that old man's fund for Jordan because you would not step up fast enough." For a moment, the room felt completely still. Old man. That was how he referred to my grandfather, the only person who had ever shown me unconditional support. Hearing Rick reduce him to something disposable, something owed, added a layer of heat I had not felt before. But I did not interrupt. His admission was too significant, too useful, too revealing. He continued rambling, blaming me for not paying fast enough, not giving enough, not carrying the family as eagerly as he expected. His words spilled through the receiver, dripping entitlement, frustration, and years of expectation, and I let every one of them land without response. Eventually, he paused, realizing I still had not spoken. "Hello?" he barked. "Did your little feelings get hurt again?" "Of course they did. You always get emotional when we ask you to do your part." I ended the call without a word. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the truth he had just handed me, full of evidence laid out with his own careless pride, full of the shift that happens when someone exposes themselves more clearly than you ever could have hoped. I replayed the recording once, staring at the waveform pulsing across my phone. His insults, his tone, his confession. Every second was another brick in the case Eleanor was building. Without waiting for doubt to creep in, I attached the audio file to an email drafted to her the night before. In the subject line, I typed, "Recording 1." In the message, I wrote the exact sentence I had already rehearsed in my head. "You asked for his own words. Here they are." Then I hit send and watched the message disappear into the outbox, feeling the quiet rumble of a new chapter beginning. The email from Eleanor arrived the next morning with the subject line "Financial Clarification Meeting," and the message was as calm and concise as she always was. "I have scheduled a meeting with your family for Thursday at 3 at a neutral conference space downtown. They will be informed that this is to review the Harbor Fund and related financial activity. You should come prepared with all documents we discussed." My pulse steadied as I read it. This was not a confrontation in a living room where Rick controlled the volume. This was not a kitchen argument where my mother would smooth everything over with excuses. This would be a table where facts mattered more than roles and where paper carried more weight than anyone's temper. By noon, Eleanor confirmed that Rick had agreed to attend along with my mother and Jordan. She added one more line, a subtle warning, but also a reassurance. "I will make clear that unresolved misuse of the trust may require formal investigation. The suggestion alone would shake them." And it did. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Do not make your stepfather look bad. He has done his best." I stared at the text, feeling an old mixture of disbelief and exhaustion rise in my chest. Even now, even with the bruise still visible, even with proof of the trust misuse, she was worried about his reputation, not the mark on my arm or the mark under my name. I did not reply. There was nothing left to explain to someone who had chosen not to see. Instead, I spent the next hour preparing my folder just as Eleanor had instructed. I placed the original trust at the front, smoothing the edges the way my grandfather had once done, while explaining each clause to me on his porch. Behind it, I added the printed screenshots of the bank withdrawals, each one circled in red. Then the disbursement form with the forged signature, the recording transcript, the actual audio file downloaded to my phone. And finally, the photo of the bruise, the one that marked the point where financial exploitation and physical aggression had finally collided. Every piece of evidence told the same story, but now the story had structure. It had authority. It had a place to be heard. On Thursday, the sky over Portland was gray in the way it often is before rain. I arrived 20 minutes early and met Eleanor in the hallway outside the conference room. She greeted me with a nod and a brief, reassuring hand on my shoulder, then reviewed the plan one more time. Present calmly. Do not engage if they try to emotionalize. We are here to clarify, not to argue. I followed her inside. The room was quiet modern with a long table and 3 chairs on each side. I set my folder neatly in front of me and placed my phone face down beside it. Through the glass window, I saw them arrive. Rick first walking with that familiar confidence, shoulders back, chin slightly raised as if he had already decided the tone of the meeting. Jordan trailed behind him, smirking the same careless grin he wore when he bragged about that $100,000 car as if it were already his. My mother walked a step behind both of them, looking anxious, glancing between them and the door. As they entered, Rick gave a curt nod to Eleanor, then looked at me with the expression of a man who still believed he had the upper hand. I could almost hear the script running in his head, the narrative where I had overreacted, the narrative where he was the misunderstood patriarch, the narrative where this meeting would end with me apologizing and smoothing everything over like always. But I was not the same girl who swallowed every explanation. I was not walking into this meeting as the one expected to pay the bills. I was walking in with documents, signatures, numbers, laws. Eleanor began by welcoming them and explaining the purpose of the meeting, a financial clarification review regarding the Harbor Fund Trust and recent withdrawals. The words alone made Jordan shift in his seat. My mother clasped her hands together. Rick did not move. He simply waited, convinced he could talk his way through whatever came. I lifted my gaze to the clock on the wall, letting the second hand sweep toward the hour. Then I placed my phone on the table, turned on the screen, and slid it forward until it rested beside my folder where everyone could see it. In that moment, a calm settled through me, so deep it almost felt like distance, like watching the room from somewhere above my own body. My voice in the back of my mind spoke with clarity. They thought I was walking in as their wallet. I was walking in as their auditor. Rick settled into the chair across from me with a practiced sigh, the kind meant to signal weariness and responsibility. He placed one hand on the table and shook his head as if the situation pained him deeply. I watched the performance begin even before Eleanor finished her introduction. "Thank you for meeting with us," he said, directing his voice toward her with a tone of humble concern. "We have been worried about Kira. She has been unstable since Christmas, and we just want to understand what happened." He made sure to avoid looking at the bruise photo sitting in my folder, the one he had caused. My mother nodded quickly as if trying to reinforce his narrative before anyone questioned it. "She has been emotional lately," she whispered. "Maybe overwhelmed." Rick pressed a hand to his chest, playing the role of the patient stepfather carrying a burden. We thought the meeting might help clear up her confusion. Jordan leaned back, smirking, as if the room already belonged to them. I kept my face still, letting the silence work in my favor. Eleanor did not indulge any of it. She folded her hands neatly and said, "Thank you for your concern. But today we are here for facts, not feelings. Now we will begin with an audio file provided by Kira." The shift in Rick's expression was small but unmistakable. His jaw tightened a fraction, then he forced a polite smile to hide it. Eleanor reached forward, tapped her laptop, and the recording filled the room. Rick's voice blasted through the speakers, unfiltered, direct, nakedly honest in all the ways he never intended it to be. You need to come back and fix this family mess. You are dramatic. You are ungrateful. Without us, you are just some girl with a clipboard at a construction site. My mother flinched. Jordan stopped smirking. Rick's eyes darted toward me, his mask slipping before he caught himself. Eleanor continued the recording without pause. Then came the line that hung heavier than the rest. We used that old man's fund for Jordan because you would not step up fast enough. The words echoed against the conference room walls, landing with a weight that no argument could soften. Old man. That was how he spoke of the man who left me the Harbor Fund, the man who helped raise me with more kindness than Rick offered in all his years. My mother blinked rapidly, her throat tightening. "You said it was approved," she whispered, turning toward Rick. "You told me Kira agreed." Jordan's face drained of color. "Wait, you used it for my school," he snapped. "You said she signed off." Rick lifted his shoulders in a weak shrug, trying to seem calm under scrutiny. "I was angry," he muttered. "People say things when they are angry. I did not mean half of that." He forced a laugh that died halfway out. The recording obviously caught me at a bad moment. Eleanor watched him with the steady, unblinking patience of someone accustomed to half-truths and deflection. She clicked to open a spreadsheet projected onto the screen. "Then let us step away from emotion," she said. "These are the withdrawals from the Harbor Fund over the past 18 months. Every transaction was highlighted in red. Every amount, every timestamp, every memo, and every instance labeled family expenses but traced back to Rick's bank account." Here, Eleanor said, tapping the date that matched the forged disbursement document. This withdrawal required Kira's written consent. It was processed with a signature that does not match hers. She slid the paper forward, the forged form circled clearly. My mother covered her mouth. Jordan looked at Rick with a mixture of disbelief and self-preservation, the kind that surfaces when someone realizes their benefit might now cost them something. Rick's composure cracked for the first time. He leaned forward, palms flat on the table, like he could push the truth back into place through sheer posture. "It is family money," he insisted. "We all shared it. It is not like she was using it." The words fell into silence, as flat as they sounded. Eleanor did not move. She simply tilted her head slightly as if observing a specimen. "The Harbor Fund Trust is not shared. It is not family money. It is a legally designated fund for Kira only. Its terms are unambiguous." She turned toward the folder I had brought. "And that brings us to the original trust document." I slid the folder across the table, and she removed the paper copy that bore my grandfather's signature and the notary stamp. She placed it gently in the center of the table, turning it so that the paragraph in question faced Rick. For a moment, the room felt frozen. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she leaned closer. Jordan held his breath. Eleanor read aloud the clause in a clear, measured voice. "No distributions may be made to any other beneficiary without Kira's written consent." The words landed with the force of a gavel. "This means," she said, "that any use of these funds without her approval is a violation of the trust, and the falsified signature constitutes potential fraud under state law." Rick's face drained of its usual confidence. His mouth opened, then closed again, soundless at first. When he finally spoke, the bravado was gone, replaced by something tight and strained. "This is being blown out of proportion. I was trying to help the family." Eleanor did not bother responding to the defense. She simply closed the folder and folded her hands. The facts speak for themselves. And they had. Every insult, every dollar, every forged mark, publicly exposed in a room where his authority held no power. For the first time, Rick looked small. And for the first time, I felt something close to justice, beginning to take shape. The silence that followed the reading of the trust clause felt different from the earlier quiet in the room. This one was heavy-structured, undeniable. Rick had no space left to twist narratives or bury facts under raised voices and guilt. The evidence lay in front of him on clean white paper, illuminated by the overhead lights more powerful than any accusation I could have spoken. Eleanor allowed that silence to sit for several seconds before she leaned forward and folded her hands. Now that the facts are clear, she said we can discuss corrective action. Her tone was not aggressive. It was precise, the way someone handles a matter that is not personal but procedural. Something with rules and consequences already built into it. She slid a printed sheet across the table toward Rick. The proposal is straightforward. First, you will return all funds withdrawn from the Harbor Fund, including the interest it would have earned had it remained intact. Rick stared at the document as if the words were in another language. Eleanor continued unfazed. Second, you will sign a non-interference agreement stating that you will not attempt to access or influence any of Kira's financial accounts or assets again. Third, you will agree to cease all contact with her outside of necessary legal communication. My mother let out a small gasp. Jordan shifted in his chair, clearly calculating how each item affected him. Rick finally managed to find his voice, though it came out thinner, angrier than the confident tone he had used earlier. This is ridiculous. Families share. Families support each other. I did what was necessary. Eleanor did not match his heat. If these conditions are not met, she said evenly, I will recommend that Kira proceed with a formal report to the State Financial Investigation Unit and to civil court. A trust violation of this magnitude qualifies for review. The implication hung in the air. Investigation, court, records, consequences that extended far beyond a family disagreement. Jordan's reaction was immediate. His bravado evaporated, replaced with a jittery fear he did not try to hide. Wait, he said, looking between Rick and Eleanor. If the trust gets investigated, they will look at everything right. Like everything. The loans, the mortgage, the car application. His voice cracked at the last word, and for the first time I saw something like panic flicker behind his eyes. Jordan's dream car, his pride, his symbol of favoritism, could unravel if scrutiny touched their finances. He swallowed hard and whispered, Dad, what did you do? Rick glared at him, but there was no command left in his expression. No authority, only frustration at being cornered by the very papers he assumed no one would read. Eleanor remained composed. The choice is yours, she said calmly, returning her attention to Rick. Resolve this privately or face a more public process. I felt both Jordan and my mother looking at me, searching for softness, leniency, something familiar from the years when I gave more than I had. But that version of me was gone. Eleanor turned toward me. Kira, do you have any additional requests before we finalize the agreement? I kept my voice steady, controlled, giving nothing away. I just want what was mine. And I want this to stop. The simplicity of the words seemed to hit harder than if I had shouted. My mother blinked rapidly, realizing how much ground she had already lost. Jordan looked down at his hands, and Rick stiffened, unable to disguise the corner he had backed himself into. Eventually, after a long, heavy pause, he grabbed the pen Eleanor set before him. His jaw tightened as he scribbled his signature, the lines jagged and angry. He pushed the paper back across the table hard enough to make it slide several inches. There, are you satisfied now? Eleanor did not react. She just reached calmly for the document, inspected it, then placed it into her folder for filing. That will conclude our meeting, she said firmly. You will receive copies of the signed agreement and repayment instructions within the next 48 hours. Everyone stood. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. My mother looked lost. Jordan looked shaken. And Rick walked toward the door with a stiff, angry stride, as if the hallway itself owed him an apology. I gathered my papers quietly, letting the noise of their exit fade down the corridor. But just as Rick reached the doorway, he paused and glanced back. For a fraction of a second, his eyes flashed not with regret, but with something sharper, a stubborn resolve that did not match the signature he had just put on paper. It was the look of a man who believed rules did not apply to him, A man who had forged one signature before and might be willing to cross another line again. As the door shut behind him, I exhaled slowly, feeling the shift of air in the room. I should have known a signature on paper was not enough to change a man who had forged one before. 3 weeks passed before I saw him again, long enough for the bruise on my arm to fade into a soft yellow blur and for the paperwork Eleanor filed to begin moving through its quiet, inevitable channels. I had started sleeping better. I had begun reclaiming the silence in my apartment as something peaceful rather than something empty. I had even gone back to running the waterfront trail on weekends, letting the cold Portland air scrape away the last of the tension that Christmas night had left behind. So when I stepped out of the temporary office trailer at the construction site that morning and saw Rick standing near the gravel path, hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets, the air around me tightened. He looked smaller against the backdrop of cranes and half-framed steel. Out of place, like someone trying to insert himself into a world he did not understand. "Kira," he called out, as if he had every right to be there. I did not walk toward him. I simply waited. He took it as an invitation. His steps were uneven and hurried, and when he stopped in front of me, I caught the faint smell of stress on his breath. "We need to talk," he said. His voice was flat-scraped raw, not from humility, but from desperation. I folded my arms and kept my expression neutral. "About what?" He exhaled hard. "The house. The bank is talking about a possible review because of the trust stuff. They are freezing certain accounts until everything clears. They are threatening to reassess the mortgage. Jordan got contacted by the loan officer. They suspended his application because of the financial discrepancy." He said the last words like he was choking on them. Jordan suspended. The golden child hit by the very system he had always assumed would bend for him. Rick rubbed a hand across his face. "They are saying this whole thing could cost us the house if someone does not step in and stabilize things. You could talk to them. You have the cleanest record. You always have." He paused, then added as if rehearsed, "You owe the family that much." That sentence landed in the dirt between us heavier than any accusation. "You owe the family." The same line they had pulled apart and reused each time they needed something from me. I said nothing. Silence made him nervous. He shifted again, and when he spoke, his tone slipped into the old, familiar condescension, even now when he needed me. "You know," he said, "if it were not for the stability we gave you, you would not even have this job. You needed a calm base to start from. We provided that." He said it like a fact, like history could be rewritten simply because he declared it so. And something in me almost laughed, not from amusement but from the absurdity that even at his lowest point, even when consequences pressed against his door, he still reached for the same script, still framed himself as the architect of my life. I opened the office door behind me slightly so no one else from the site would wander over and hear. Then I looked directly at him. "You think you gave me stability?" Rick straightened a little defensive. "Of course we did. You had a roof food routine. Not perfect, but better than what some kids get." My voice stayed level calm. "Do you know what I actually did with the stability you claim you gave me?" He hesitated. "What?" "I used it to leave." His face twitched, not understanding. I continued. "While you were busy spending money that was not yours, I was saving mine. While you lectured me about responsibility, I was doing the responsible thing. And while you thought you were draining every asset I had, I was putting aside enough to separate my life from yours permanently." His eyes narrowed, confused. "What do you mean, separate?" I let the truth land without raising my voice. I used the remaining portion of my trust and my own salary to put a down payment on a condo. It is already under contract. It is in my name only. No ties, no shared anything, no co-signers, no access points. His mouth parted slightly, an expression I had never seen on him, not anger, not confidence, something much closer to disbelief and fear. "You what?" I stepped forward just enough so he could not mistake the firmness in my tone. I will not be stabilizing anything for you. I will not be speaking to the bank. I will not be helping Jordan. And I will not be protecting a house that you endangered with your own decisions. You left a mark on me so I would remember my place. I touched my arm lightly, the ghost of the bruise still present in memory, even if not in color. I did remember. It is just not in your house anymore. Rick stumbled back half a step as if the words hit something unsteady inside him. For the first time since I had known him, he looked his age. Not strong, not commanding, not the loud figure who filled every doorway. Just a man who had built an entire hierarchy on control and suddenly found himself standing beneath it. He opened his mouth like he might argue, then closed it again when he realized there was no script left to pull from. No leverage, no guilt he could use. Only consequences. He walked away slowly, shoulders slumped, boots, crunching against gravel until his figure shrank against the gray sky. I watched him go, feeling neither triumph nor anger, just clarity. The funny thing about marks is that they fade on skin, but not on memory or on paper. And mine were finally documented exactly where they needed to be. Moving into my new apartment felt strangely quiet at first. Not the uneasy quiet of waiting for someone to raise their voice or slam a door, but the kind that settles into the walls like warm sunlight. The place was small and simple, tucked into a residential corner of Portland with a view of fir trees and a courtyard that caught the morning light in a soft glow. I carried the last box inside, closed the door behind me, and let the click of the lock echo through the room. It was the first time in years that sound had meant safety instead of isolation. I set the box down and stood in the center of the living room, taking in the pale hardwood floors, the tall windows, the clean air untouched by tension. For the first time since I was a teenager, there was no one calling my name to come fix a bill, no one asking for a ride, no one telling me I owed them something for existing, just silence shaped like possibility. I unpacked slowly that day, placing things with intention, choosing what deserved space and what did not. When I opened the folder labeled receipts, the photo of the bruise sat on top. The mark had completely faded from my skin, but seeing that image reminded me that it had happened and that it had meant something. I did not feel anger. I did not feel revenge. I simply felt clarity. That photo was no longer evidence against anyone. It was evidence for me, proof of a line I would never let anyone cross again. I closed the folder gently and slid it into a drawer, not hidden, but not displayed. Just kept. A reminder not of pain, but of boundaries. Later, as I sat near the window watching the sun dip behind the buildings, I thought about the money I had lost over the years. The countless small transactions, the favors, the obligations, the responsibilities that had never truly been mine. It used to feel like a hole I could never fill, but now looking back it felt more like tuition, the cost of learning where not to invest again. Some families do not just borrow money, they borrow your peace, and they never plan to pay it back. Stepping out of that cycle had given me something far more valuable than any trust fund or returned payment. It had given me the room to breathe without asking permission. On my first Sunday morning in the new place, I brewed coffee, opened the window, and let the cold air roll in. No arguments, no guilt, no footsteps demanding something from me. Just quiet, and freedom tucked neatly inside it. Moving on did not feel like cutting ties. It felt like releasing chains. And I knew there were people watching this who might feel those chains tugging at them too. People who had been made to believe that love required sacrifice without limits. That loyalty meant surrender. That responsibility meant carrying everyone else while no one carried them. If you have ever had to walk away from people who thought they owned your wallet and your life, just drop a listening in the comments or tell me where you are watching from. I read every single one. I want you to know something. Leaving does not make you ungrateful. Setting boundaries does not make you cruel. Refusing to be used does not make you wrong. It makes you free. And freedom, especially the quiet kind, is worth protecting.